I'm independent program attorney Richard Hayes.
I'm independent program attorney Emily Taylor.
And we are following up with a ton of questions that we received during our YouTube live. We try to get to as many questions as we can, but we had so many left over that we wanted to go through and go back and answer these specific questions, and they don't fit in necessarily one topic or another. So we got a grab bag of incredible Second Amendment and firearms related questions. So let's get right into it. The first question we have is from Bob K. I live in Illinois and I want reciprocity with other states. What's the best state permit I can get?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one a lot of people have. But the problem is that without knowing where you travel to most, I really can't give you a good answer, because that's the dispositive piece of information here, right? Is, because at each of these non-resident licenses that are pretty easy to seek, like Florida non-resident, Texas non-resident, Virginia, yes. They're not all going to be recognized uniformly. And, generally speaking, when we have these biggies, they're recognized in about the same number of states. It's just different states. So you want to know first where you're going to make sure that let's say you want to go to, Montana, right? You want to make sure it's recognized there. But we also need to know, do you want to go to a state that doesn't recognize non-resident licenses at all? Because if you're thinking, Bob, you are thinking, well, gosh, I go to Colorado all the time, and that's where I really want to be able to carry. Well, Colorado recognizes, let's say, a Texas license, but they don't recognize any non-resident licenses, so you're really just stuck.
Yep. But I think that covers it. Next question. What do we got?
Greg wants to know, is it true that some people go to jail after being forced to defend themselves from an attacker?
Greg, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the answer is yes. We see this come up all the time. People have acted in justified self-defense, defense of themselves, defense of others, defense of property. They get arrested, charged, put through the system, and it comes back to our key principle of, self-defense is what's called a plea and abatement or a justification, otherwise excluding criminal responsibility. What you're saying is, I did this, what would otherwise be considered a crime, but it's okay because I was saving my life. I was stopping a robbery. I was, stopping a kidnapping, or someone was breaking into my car with me inside of it, trying to carjack me. So, because we have that principle of, because general rule, it's a crime to point guns at people. It's a crime to shoot people, stab people, run people over with cars. But sometimes when you're fighting for your life, it's a last resort. It's okay. And that's what our law says. And so because we have that, hey, you're doing what was normally considered a crime, we see a ton of people get arrested. Yeah,
and I think, unfortunately, the more politicized and polarized we get as a country, the more likely it is that people get arrested on these self-defense instances, because you have a lot of, just politics and media influence involved, and no one wants to be the ultimate arbiter to say, I'm not arresting this guy, or I'm not charging this guy, or I'm not prosecuting this guy. If you put it in the hands of a jury, all the politicians and the people who work for politicians, their hands are clean.
Yep. All right, next question comes from Marlon. How often are guns used in self-defense compared to other weapons?
I'm getting all the questions that are really hard to answer.
I'll kick it off.
Yeah, well, we really don't know.
Right. Yeah. We have limited data. The data that we have came out of the Obama administration. They were researching defensive gun incidents, and this is the range that they gave us. 500,000 to 3 million per year was their rough estimate. So, we have a huge range of cases there. But I'll tell you, in our practical experience, we see so many self-defense cases, and they don't necessarily get reported.
They don't get reported, right?
That's the thing.
That's the issue, is that the number of people that we talk to on a daily basis who have used a firearm in self-defense or any other weapon, but, let's go with firearm here. They generally, if it's just a display and the person retreats, they'll call us and, I didn't call the police because I didn't have to use it. And
right.
It's like, well,
the crime was stopped. Why would I call the police?
Yeah. And it's like, well, you did use it. You used it in justified self-defense, but there is no way to log that data if you don't report it.
Yep.
All right. John B. wants to know, do states with strict gun control laws see a decrease involving guns? I know you like this one.
Yeah. Well, I think you can just open up a newspaper to know that that's not the case. We look at our cities with the strictest gun control: New York City, Baltimore, Maryland, Chicago, Illinois. And those cities are making headlines for reasons. They can, and I think it comes back down to the principle of, you can have as many laws on the books as you want, but if you're not enforcing them or if you triple, quadruple, or octuply criminalize something, guess what? Guess who doesn't care about how many times something is criminalized? It's criminals.
Right. And that's, we do have some data about, people who are sitting in prison who have used a firearm in their criminal offense. We have data about, this is, I think, a really good data set, how they obtained that firearm.
Yep.
And more often than not, the answer is, I stole it.
Yep.
Or I bought it off the streets illegally when I wasn't allowed to buy one in a store.
Yep.
And so, you think, well, if we could just restrict, who can buy guns, we'll stop gun crime. Well, absolutely not, because the criminals are breaking laws. That's what they do.
And we see, and again, we're kind of talking loosey-goosey, but big picture, we see states and countries, for that matter, that have strict gun control laws. There is an increased rate of home invasions, because criminals know, hey, if I kick down the door of this house, the chances that there's a gun on the other side of the door are lower. And so the only people, it comes back to the principle, the only people who are following the law is law-abiding citizens, gun owners, us, we bend over backwards. And I talk to hundreds of people a year who are they just want to follow the law.
Yeah. Well, and, we were both prosecutors, and we know, particularly these felony level offenses, violent offenses, the people who commit these offenses, they're not stupid.
No.
They are picking their victims carefully. If they can just choose between me, in my dress and my high heels walking out of the office, or Richard looking like he's carrying a gun, they're going to choose me because they're going to think I'm an easier target. And so, and that's just, we're not dealing with idiots. We're dealing with bad people.
Right. Next question. Stacy asks, may I lawfully transfer to an individual who resides in another state? So we're talking about transferring a firearm between residents of two different states. And what do you have to say?
Yeah. So, and now every state's law will vary. But so I'll tell you, on the federal level, there isn't restriction. There's no federal law that generally governs a private sale within your own state. However, your state law may govern that. So you might live in a state like Texas where, private sales, we've got rules about, don't transfer a firearm to someone
intoxicated people.
Who's intoxicated, someone is going to use it to commit an offense. But generally speaking, there aren't a lot of rules and regulations otherwise that govern it. You have some states where, unless you're selling to a family member, you have to go through an FFL and get a background check, or you have to do that anyway, even if it's a family member. So intrastate really does depend. But when we're talking about interstate, I guess that's a little bit easier because the federal law does control.
Yeah, easy rule. You have to go through an FFL. And so you're, I'm person A, I live in one state, person B lives in another state. You're going to be sending the firearm to an FFL in person B's state. And the FFL in that state is really the person who's facilitating the transfer. And they're going to make sure that they're fully qualified under state and federal law to accept the rifle, shotgun, handgun. And that way, the liability is off you at that point.
Yes.
And it's really between that FFL and person B in that other state.
And this is really strict. So I'll give you an example. Let's say this was from Stacy. Let's say that you have a firearm you want to transfer to your nephew, and you are in Louisiana, and your nephew's from Texas, and he drives into Louisiana, and you say, I just want to gift you this firearm. This is for you. I love you. Enjoy it. And you think he can just drive back to Texas with it. Absolutely not. It's that strict. Even though you're not even charging him for it, it's a gift between family members. You are going to have to send it to an FFL dealer in Texas because you are residents of different states.
Yep.
All right. So next we've got, do I need a federal firearms license to make a firearm for my own personal use, provided it is not being made for resale? It sounds like the person who asked this already knows the answer.
Yes. So, and the general rule on this is under federal law, the answer is no. But that's not the end of the story. We have to look at state law. Some states do criminalize manufacturing your own firearms, making homemade guns, making unserialized guns. So obviously you got to follow the law in the state that you're located. But under federal law, there's no law criminalizing making your own guns, taking an 80% lower and finishing it out, constructing it from scratch, 0% lowers. We see a trend on those.
Oh yeah. It's a long celebrated tradition in this country to be able to manufacture your own firearm for your own personal use, right? One that you're not intending to resell.
Yeah. Next question. Jack asks, is it true that a person is prohibited by law, if they're prohibited by law from possessing a firearm, can they use a black powder muzzle loading firearm?
So under federal law, and again, we have to talk about both federal and state law here because that's just the world we live in, right?
Yep.
Why make things easy when we can make it doubly complicated? Under federal law, these black powder pistols and rifles, muzzle loaders are generally not. I say generally because every once in a while you come across a black powder pistol that actually does not qualify as. But we have this law under federal law that says, essentially replicas of or antique firearms made it's 1898, I believe, are not firearms. They're exempted from the definition of firearms, which means that the laws governing possession and purchase of firearms do not apply to these items. Most states mirror that directly and make it very easy.
Yep.
Some do not. So I would say to Jack, the general answer to that is yes, that is true, but be certain that you check your state's law just to be sure.
Yep. Next question we have is, with self-defense such as a home burglar or home invasion, what's legally defined as self-defense in a case, and why is it maybe not an assault? This question's from CB. What I'll say on that is, whenever you're defending yourself, you could be exercising multiple defense rights. If a person breaks down your house and you're defending yourself and your spouse and your kids, or let's say they kick down the door and maybe they're trying to set a fire, or they, you can add in one of these little facts. You could be defending against a whole bunch of different crimes, not necessarily just a burglary, not necessarily just an assault. You could be defending against a whole heck of a lot of different crimes. One that comes up in Texas is, a felony, let's say they end up killing somebody inside the house, felony murder. You could be defending against all of these different crimes all at once, and depending on who you're defending and what you're defending, you might have multiple paths or multiple defenses that you're going to assert. Oh
yeah, absolutely. It is, and I think bear in mind, because we're looking at what is legally defined as self-defense and not assault. We can have potentially a situation where one can run into the other. So let's say that you have a home invasion burglar. Mm-hmm. You have shot them and effectively made them no longer a threat.
Right.
But they're on the ground alive and you are just waiting for police to arrive. You have defended yourself and you should not be criminally liable for assaulting that person because of the justification of self-defense. However, if while you're waiting on the police and they're no longer a threat, you walk over to them, you shoot them in the head, right?
Right.
Well, at that point, you have gone from justified self-defense, not going to be liable for a crime,
right,
to not only assault, but probably murder, right, as well. So these things are not just complicated in the way that Richard mentioned, but they can be fluid as well within the same interaction.
Yep. Next one I have for you, Emily. Bill asks, when traveling across state lines on vacation, are gun laws different for RVs than they are for, let's say, cars?
Yeah. So, and we touched on this a little bit in our last segment on traveling.
Yeah.
And it really is the difference between, when you're using your RV as a car, the answer is no. The rules are exactly the same as when you're in your just standard everyday, pickup truck.
Right.
But the difference with an RV is it can be converted from a car to a home, to a dwelling.
Yeah.
And that's where the difference in gun laws come in. So once you are parked, once you're hooked up, that becomes no longer your vehicle.
Yep.
It becomes your dwelling, which in some states gives you more castle doctrine rights.
Yep.
Depending on where you're parked. In some states, it might give you different carry rights.
Right.
And certainly it gives you different rights when it comes to the police searching your vehicle.
Yeah. And so, we see this come up from time to time. When police officers pull over a vehicle, let's say they're suspected of speeding. When a police officer comes up to the car, they have a different standard applied to them than if they come up and knock on the door of your house, because the courts have said, hey, look, this thing is movable. There's not a whole heck of a lot of time. The typical rule to search would be they would need probable cause. They would need to go get a warrant. If they wanted to search the inside of your house, they'd have to have probable cause. They'd have to go get a warrant from a judge. But because of it's really they're relying on exigency. Mm-hmm. Because of that, the courts have said, hey, if this person just has probable cause, we're going to do away with the warrant requirement. They can go in and search that car. And the same is not true if, let's say, you're at a campground, you're parked, you're hooked up. Maybe it's the middle of the night. Maybe you're sleeping. Maybe you're in your pajamas. You have all these facts that show, hey, I'm using this thing as my house. I'm not using it as my dwelling or as my habitation. States call it different things, but you have all these evidentiary factors that say, hey, look, this is being used like my house. And at that point, the standards increase. And, in states, there are a handful of states where you would get castle doctrine protections inside of a house and maybe not an unoccupied vehicle. Mm-hmm. And so that's where it would matter, and it affects self-defense.
Absolutely. Jenny wants to know, where can I find reliable information about concealed carry laws in my state?
There's a whole lot of resources. I would go to the education tab on uslawshield.com. They have a ton of different guides. They have travel guides. They have, the when can I legally shoot guides for each of the states. And if you're a member, then you can reach out and request to speak to an independent program attorney from that state. And they'll walk you through if you have any specific questions.
Yeah. And otherwise, it is really difficult because what you're reading on forums, you can absolutely never trust. The other trustworthy source of information, I would say, is whatever state you're in. Go to their criminal code, start using the search tab and see if you can find it.
Yeah.
That's tough. That's tough even for attorneys. We spend hours getting the lay of the land in different states, trying to figure out what their laws look like.
Yep.
But that is another reliable resource for you that is open, available to the public. Virtually every state I know of has their codes posted online now.
Yes. Dalton asked, he wanted a little bit more information on LEOs, law enforcement officers, carrying especially, he said that there's some confusion around HB 218. He said, enjoy the show. What do we have to say about carrying under the authority of LEOSA?
Yeah, LEOSA is, it's a really good resource for active duty and retired officers.
Yep.
It's the closest thing we have in this country to national reciprocity, essentially, because it does open carry up to officers in all 50 states. However, there are differences between active duty and retired officers. So, for example, if you're a retired officer carrying under LEOSA, you still have to respect all of the trespass laws,
right,
in the state that you are in, right? So, and that's tough because, your home state, you might be pretty comfortable with, well, I understand what the trespass laws are here with firearms, but you're in another state, you might not completely understand.
Right.
And you are subject to all of those. Plus, LEOSA has qualifications, expirations, things of this nature. And
I'll talk about the affirmative defense
exactly.
issue. We have, and this comes up, same thing with the Firearm Owners Protection Act, the safe passage provision. We have a handful of jurisdictions, and I bet you can guess who they are, who treat LEOSA like an affirmative defense, like a defense to prosecution, which means, let's say you're beat bopping around in Manhattan, you're a police officer from, the state of Florida, and you have your concealed handgun on you. And for whatever reason, you come into contact with law enforcement, they discover the gun. What we see happen more frequently than we like to see is that they are arresting the police officer, the out-of-towner, and charging him with that state gun crime. And they're treating this LEOSA protection as an affirmative defense, which means at trial you'd have to prove, hey, look, this law doesn't apply to me because I'm carrying under the authority of this great federal law. But that does not keep the person from having a very life-disrupting vacation, from having to show up to court, from having to hire an attorney. So it can be very life-disrupting. Got to be very careful. There are just some states that have zero respect for the Second Amendment, and you have to be aware of those gun hostile states when you're traveling to those.
Yeah, and bear in mind as well that when we're talking about gun laws generally, there are very few bars to arrest.
Yes.
Right? Most of the things we talk about when we talk about exceptions to the law when carrying firearms, they are defenses, which means it will not necessarily stop you from being arrested. It is something that you need to show up in court and affirmatively assert. And, hopefully that's enough to get your case dismissed pre-trial. But, sometimes it's something that has to go in jury instruction. And that's years of your life and tens of thousands of dollars as well. Yeah. So it's tough. Okay, Diane wants to know, if I carry my gun in my car in case someone tries to carjack my car or kidnap me, will I be in trouble if I shoot them to protect myself?
Ooh, it's going to depend on what state you're in, Diane. But, let's assume you're lawfully possessing a firearm, because some states would criminalize it. If you had a license, you didn't have a license, but let's have some assumptions here. Mm-hmm. You're lawfully carrying. Someone is threatening you with, kidnapping, maybe aggravated kidnapping, maybe serious bodily injury, maybe great bodily harm, maybe even death, depending on what the state is going to call it. So it's going to depend on that state's specific self-defense laws. What we see come up time and time again, though, is a lot of states have castle doctrine protections in the vehicle. When someone is trying to forcefully and unlawfully enter or forcefully and unlawfully trying to remove, what does that look like? Stopped at a red light, somebody comes and, maybe your door's unlocked and they open the door, or maybe they smash the window out and they start reaching to open the handle, or, a carjacking, at the end of the day. We see a lot of states say, hey, you're allowed to protect yourself, utilizing deadly force, deadly physical force in response to a carjacking. And so, but it goes back to that one of the questions we had in the very, very beginning from Greg about, could you get arrested? It's possible. It's possible. Remember, all this stuff is a justification to what would otherwise be a crime.
Right. And I would also say, in the vehicle context, we have lots of jurisdictions. We have lots of states. Heck, even in Texas, where we have castle doctrine in the vehicle,
Yep.
If it is not truly a carjacking and you use that firearm either by display or discharge, you will be arrested.
Yep.
Because there is, and this is universal throughout the country, there's this idea in law enforcement that when you are safely within your vehicle,
Your big metal box.
you are totally protected, which we all know is not necessarily true.
Right.
But it does mean that uses of firearms when you are inside your vehicle can often be hyper scrutinized.
Yep.
So it is something to take very seriously. I always tell people, if you can put your foot on the gas, if you can avoid the situation by any means while you're in your car, you must do that first, because of this perception that, you're just safe in your car, which again, we know is not necessarily true, but it can really mess with you legally.
And I'll throw one more monkey wrench into the scenario, because juries, just as a practical matter, I don't know what it is, they hate defensive incidents on the roadways.
They do.
And I think it also goes back to the, big metal box. Obviously, that's, kind of part of the perception. But you're in this thing that if you just, push a few centimeters down with your foot, you can be in a different location very quickly. And so a lot of people, and even in stand your ground states where there's no legal duty for the person to retreat, we just see juries have such a difficult time reconciling it with, why didn't you just drive away? So I know that makes it sound like, oh, Richard and Emily says I'm not allowed to defend myself in my car. We're not saying that. Some people just need killing. Sometimes you have to defend yourself, and it's a last resort, and you have to fight for your life. But just know that it is going to be hyper scrutinized.
It is.
The next question we have from Marilyn. Let's say you have a gun locked up in a case. Do you have to disclose it? Or let's say, do you have to tell the police officer or volunteer that information if you're pulled over? And this is going to depend on states, but what do you say?
Yeah, so it does vary state by state. My general advice is, if your state does not require that affirmative disclosure, don't do it.
Yeah.
And I would say, if you are not a license holder, most states don't require the affirmative disclosure. If you are a handgun license holder, states differ as to whether or not you have to disclose just that fact that you're a handgun license holder, or I'm a handgun license holder and I have a handgun in the car. But my general advice to people is, you never know. Do you have a rookie officer who is less than comfortable dealing with civilian interactions with firearms?
Right.
Do you have an officer who's just returned to active duty from having to defend himself or being in a use of force incident? And he's very, very squirrely about the presence of firearms on this first traffic stop when he's back. So it seems like an unnecessary complication to me. What do you tell people when they ask you?
So again, if your state law requires it, obviously you got to follow the law. But in states where disclosure is not required, again, and I'd say that's probably the vast majority of states, it is pretty weird when an officer comes up and knocks on the window and says, hey, you know what, I pulled you over, and you say, I got a gun. That freaks them out. So not volunteering the information is generally what I'm telling my clients in the cases where they're not legally obligated to disclose. And but then in the scenarios where if an officer asks, hey, do you have a firearm in the vehicle? Unless there's something else going on, there's no reason to withhold the information.
No, but what I will say is it is very understandable human nature to gesture to your firearm when asked where it is.
No, it's like when you get out of the car and you adjust yourself. Yeah.
Control that. So if asked, and if, because I've had to disclose, there are times where I'm wearing a work dress and I've got a pistol in my purse and I get pulled over for speeding, which happens more often than I generally like to admit. And, I have to say, officer, when I reach into my handbag to get my license, you are probably going to see a pistol. What do you want me to do?
Yeah.
But, when you're having to have that kind of interaction, keep your hands on the steering wheel. I mean, think about that. Talk yourself through the interaction first, because if you say, well, there's a gun in my purse, you're going to have a much different outcome with that officer.
Yeah, I'd say avoid the word gun. That's a trigger word for trigger word for law enforcement officer. Gun, one syllable. They don't like that. Violent switch turns on.
Yeah.
Firearm
is great.
Yeah.
Carry weapon, also okay. Keep your hands on the wheel, though. Yep. Avoid gesturing to where you are carrying, because that is something that can be life or death.
Yeah. Well, I think we cleaned out the mailbag. We caught up with a bunch of y'all's questions. We had a great time going through it. Continue to submit your questions, because we love, going through these kind of, quick sessions where we can answer all of your questions. And make sure to check out some of the past episodes. We touch on a lot of these concepts in a lot of the previous discussions that we've had.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so make sure to subscribe so that you see those conversations, so you see those, we want to get your questions answered, and we have a good time talking about it.
Absolutely. And we enjoyed it. Until next time, keep those questions coming.